I was sitting with a colleague the other day, scrolling through the endless blur of geopolitical updates on my phone. You know the type. Stern men in robes, stern pronouncements from Tehran and Riyadh, the constant flash of oil and religion. So easy for your eyes to just glaze over. I admitted to him that from the outside, Iran and Saudi Arabia often look like two sides of the same coin. You know, just different flavors of the same authoritarian religious power structure. But he just shook his head and laughed. He told me that was the single biggest mistake people make. He said, "You're looking at the casing, but you're ignoring the operating system." He described one as machine where a supreme cleric holds the root admin password, trying to install a revolutionary virus on every other network. The other, an ultra-exclusive family-owned private server where the royalty is the firmware and the clerics are just the IT support. It was such a stark technical distinction. It made me realize that while these two powers might look the same on the surface, underneath, they're running on completely different blueprints, dictated by entirely different laws of physics. So the real mission of this deep dive is to look past those surface-level similarities of oil and religion, and really examine the fundamentally distinct political and ideological operating systems that govern Iran and Saudi Arabia. We're digging beneath the surface to explore the distinct ideologies and power structures that genuinely drive their every move.
And that analogy, the operating system, is incredibly useful. It really is. Because as you said, while both countries claim to be model states based on Islamic principles, their unique blend of religion and politics is actually starkly different. Iran is a theocracy that incorporates some, democratic elements. Saudi Arabia is fundamentally a hereditary monarchy. If you don't understand that core architecture, that source code, you cannot understand their rivalry, their foreign policy, or their internal dynamics. They're structured to fail in different ways and succeed based on fundamentally opposing principles.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with Iran. If we were dissecting the motherboard, what is the core architecture of this theocratic system? What's that foundational code that defines its existence?
So the Iranian system, the one established after the 1979 revolution, is structurally anti-monarchical. It replaced a dynasty, the Pahlavis, and it uniquely blends democratic features with its theocratic structure. But the entire political system is built on a very specific core programming language, 12er Shi'ism.
And that's the key difference right there. So break that down for us. How does that specific belief dictate the political structure? Because this is where we get to that foundational concept of clerical rule, the Vali Faqi.
Precisely. 12er Shi'ism is the dominant branch of Shiite Islam. Its adherents believe the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, disappeared way back in 874 AD. They believe he's currently in what they call occultation, but will one day return as the promised messianic figure. Now, in the absence of this divinely guided imam, the foundational code, it requires clerical authority to substitute for his authority, and the faithful are obliged to follow their religious rulings. This doctrine is known as Vali Faqi.
The guardianship of the jurist.
Guardianship of the jurist. And it is the institutional heart of Iran's entire political architecture.
So if the supreme leader is the Vali Faqi, that means he holds the root access. His political mandate isn't derived from the people, it's from God, as interpreted by this clerical structure.
Correct. He holds ultimate constitutional and religious authority. He's essentially exercising the powers of the Walayat Alam, the leadership of the nation. The concentration of power is vast, and it supersedes all other branches of government. We're talking about power that reaches into every functional pillar of the state. He's got supreme command of the armed forces. He declares war and peace. He resolves differences between the three wings of government, appoints the heads of the judiciary, and he even holds discretionary authority over vast swaths of the state-owned economy.
You mentioned discretionary economic power. This is where it goes beyond just a title, and you see the practical control. What does that economic reach actually look like?
It looks like the bonyads, or revolutionary foundations. These are quasi-state charitable organizations. They're built on assets that were seized after the revolution, from the deposed Pahlavi regime or from wealthy political opponents. They operate as these immense, non-transparent, tax-exempt financial empires that span construction, oil, finance, agriculture, everything. The current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, reportedly controls a multi-billion-dollar financial empire through these bonyads, which grants him immense power, totally independent of the elected branches. He can fund his loyalists and control economic sectors without any public or parliamentary scrutiny. That's true root access in economic terms.
But wait, if Iran has a popularly elected president and a parliament, the Majlis, doesn't that inherently create friction with the supreme leader? How does the system handle that crisis when an elected official is clearly at odds with the admin?
Well, that friction is intentional. And it's managed. Iran holds elections for the president, the parliament, and the assembly of experts, which is the body tasked with selecting the supreme leader. But these elected branches are what we might call sub-processes. They operate strictly within the parameters set by the theocratic kernel. The ultimate control mechanism is the 12-member Guardian Council.
The Guardian Council.
Right.
This acts as the ultimate ideological filter.
Exactly. They have two massive powers. First, all laws passed by the elected majlis have to be vetted for compatibility with Sharia law and the revolution's principles. Second, and this is maybe more important, they vet all candidates for president or parliament. They can, and they frequently do, disqualify thousands of candidates they deem insufficiently loyal or ideologically incompatible. This ensures that only approved voices ever even reach the ballot box. They interpret the Constitution itself. So while people vote, they're only choosing from a narrow range of pre-approved candidates.
So the system is designed with these democratic checks. It allows the populace to, vent some steam. But the theocratic override is always active.
Correct. The democratic process is there to legitimize the system, to involve the public. But the real levers of power, military, judiciary, constitutional interpretation, and key economic institutions are insulated from popular choice and concentrated in the supreme leader's office.
Okay, let's reboot. Let's switch systems now. Iran is a theocracy where the cleric is the ultimate source of constitutional authority. Now we move to Saudi Arabia. What is the fundamental architecture of the House of Saud system? What's its core programming?
Saudi Arabia runs on an absolute monarchical model. The core programming, the indispensable firmware, is the Al Saud hereditary family itself. The kingdom was formally established back in 1932 by Abdulaziz Saud, and the entire structure is purely dynastic.
And what serves as the constitution in this case?
The basic law of governance from 1992 states it very clearly. The Constitution is the Holy Quran, and the Sunnah, the traditions of the Prophet. The king, who has to be a descendant of the founder, is designated as the ultimate arbiter of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. He's the prime minister, the commander-in-chief, and the head of the armed forces all at once. His job is to rule the nation according to the Sharia and supervise its implementation.
So if the Quran is the constitution, where does Wahhabism fit into this system? Is it the core programming, or is it more like proprietary software tied to the hardware?
It's the proprietary software that provides crucial legitimacy. That's a great way to put it. Wahhabism is a conservative, puritanical branch of Sunni Islam, and it's been tied to the royal family since the 18th century. The original alliance was struck back in 1744 between Muhammad ibn Saud and the founder of the movement, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. This historical covenant provided the religious legitimacy to the nascent dynastic power. Wahhabi principles emphasize tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, and strictly denounce practices they see as polytheistic, which includes many Shiite practices.
So the clerics provide the theological validation for the king's rule, but they don't actually run the state. This is the great divide we need to nail down. Do the clerics, the ulama, have root access like Iran's supreme leader?
Absolutely not. And this is the single most important architectural difference. In Saudi Arabia, the clerics, the ulama, who are represented by the Senior Council of Ulama, they do not hold ultimate political authority. They are immensely influential advisors. They act as the system's high-level IT support. They provide fatwas, they legitimize government actions, but the king makes the final decision. The clerics serve the monarchical structure, they do not run it. The king defines the architecture, and religious doctrine is used as a tool for legitimacy and social control. The monarchy holds the admin password and can change the cleric's access privileges whenever it wants.
And institutionally, the system is engineered specifically to ensure the continuation of that dynastic firmware and prevent any kind of challenge.
Precisely. Unlike Iran's complicated system of elected sub-processes that then get vetoed, Saudi Arabia's structure is simpler and more absolute. Political parties are banned entirely. There are no national elections for a legislature. The succession process is internal and dynastic, managed by bodies like the Allegiance Council, which ensures power stays within the male descendants of Ibn Saud. The whole system is engineered for stability and the continuation of Al Saud rule above everything else.
That distinction is just profound. Let's synthesize the core difference then. We have two systems that look, on the surface, similar because they both invoke Islam as the basis for their state. But where does the ultimate authority actually reside in each?
The core difference is the source code of supreme power. In Iran, authority is theocratic. It stops with a religious figure, the Vali Faqi, who governs based on the Shiite belief in clerical guardianship. The highest function is maintaining the revolutionary ideology. In Saudi Arabia, authority is dynastic. It stops with the ruling family, the king, who is the ultimate arbiter of all government branches. He uses religious doctrine, Wahhabism, as a foundational tool, but the power itself is hereditary. It's a monarchy legitimized by clerics, not a government run by them.
So the cleric holds the admin password in Iran, making ideological integrity the highest function, sometimes even over national interests. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, the royalty is the operating system, prioritizing its own absolute dynastic survival and stability. This foundational reality really informs everything else we need to discuss. Which brings us to a crucial point of institutional resilience. How do these systems survive? Both regimes face significant internal pressures and dissent, particularly from youth and reform movements. So how do they manage these internal threats and ensure the longevity of their unique architectures?
This is where the system's respective security protocols become really visible. When dealing with dissent, Iran's system, despite its democratic facade, has a ruthless efficiency designed to ensure the survival of the theocratic ideology. This is absolutely central to understanding the durability of this kind of non-Western political structure.
And that goes right back to that powerful analogy you mentioned from the Tehran software engineer, Farhad. That struck me as a perfect illustration of how the system views its own citizens and the political process.
That analogy perfectly illustrates Iran's institutional resilience. Farhad described the supreme leader as the admin, who can deploy the Basij, the volunteer militia, as an immediate antivirus protocol. He said it's used to quarantine and suppress dissent, especially during street protests. He noted that when the system reacts like that, it's actually working exactly as designed. It's prioritizing the survival of the revolutionary code over user comfort or civil liberties.
Let's talk more about the Basis. They're not just, street thugs. They are ideological enforcers woven into the very social fabric.
Precisely. The Basij are a paramilitary force under the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. They report directly to the supreme leader. Their role is multifaceted. They enforce public morality, they act as ideological screening mechanisms in universities and workplaces. And most visibly, they serve as the shock troops during popular uprisings. Their presence ensures the theocratic kernel has constant boots-on-the-ground surveillance and a rapid response capability to crush any political sub-process that goes rogue.
And the chilling part of that software engineer's observation was that even elected officials, the sub-processes that people vote for, are ultimately powerless against the admin. They can just be terminated at will.
They are disposable, absolutely. The supreme leader maintains internal security not just through street violence, but through sophisticated institutional mechanisms. These are designed to purge threats, even threats coming from within the ruling clerical class itself. And this is so evident in the existence of parallel institutions like the Special Court for the Clergy.
What does that court do?
It's a political tool, plain and simple. It's used specifically to silence clerics who urge reform or challenge the regime's core ideology. For instance, Ayatollah Montazeri, who was initially designated to succeed Khomeini, was effectively placed under house arrest and ostracized after he voiced dissent about human rights abuses. The court made sure that even high-ranking clergy who tried to change the code from the inside were neutralized. So Iran's resilience, it lies not in its democratic tolerance, but in the ruthless efficiency of the theocratic kernel to self-correct by purging ideological errors.
Okay, let's compare that to Saudi Arabia's security mechanism. How does the dynastic firmware ensure its own resilience against internal challenges to the House of Saud's absolute rule?
Well, Saudi Arabia relies heavily on concentrating power, using massive economic leverage, that oil wealth, to provide subsidies and welfare benefits to ensure popular complacency, and making sure the legal system reinforces the ultimate authority of the king. Unlike Iran, which faces constant ideological challenges, Saudi Arabia faces challenges to its stability.
Let's dig into those legal structures, because both countries claim to base their courts on Islamic justice, yet both are criticized globally for severe human rights violations, including high execution rates.
And that common criticism is valid. Both regimes restrict civil liberties, engage in arbitrary arrests, and rely on oppressive surveillance. If you look at the mid-2010s, for instance, Iran and Saudi Arabia together accounted for a massive percentage of global executions recorded by international organizations. And both have controversially executed individuals for crimes they committed as minors. These high rates aren't just statistics, they are a symptom of system control.
But their approach to legal control differs architecturally, which reflects their core code. Let's start with Iran's penal code and the revolutionary courts.
Iran operates a hybrid system. While it has layers of civil, criminal, and military courts, the powerful revolutionary courts act as the institutionalized admin override for political threats. These courts handle national security cases, drug offenses, and any crime deemed a threat to the regime. And crucially, Iran's formal penal code includes specific laws allowing for harsh traditional punishments, things like amputation, flogging, and stoning. These serve to reinforce the idea that the state is governed by divine law, not secular human law.
And how is that high execution rate linked back to the system's survival?
Well, in Iran, while political executions grab the headlines, the vast majority of executions are for non-violent offenses, primarily drug crimes. Critics argue the regime uses this judicial severity against drug crimes, which affect marginalized populations, as a convenient way to project power and maintain an atmosphere of fear and control. It effectively silences broader dissent without appearing to be politically motivated in every single instance. And the revolutionary courts provide the quick, decisive mechanism for this political use of the judiciary.
Now, Saudi Arabia's judicial system is fascinating precisely because they lack a formal penal code. How does that function as a tool for enforcing the dynastic will?
It grants judges unparalleled and almost arbitrary flexibility. Saudi courts are required to issue rulings based only on Sharia interpretations, but without codified limits on penalties for many crimes, what are known as tazir offenses. This means judges can issue wide-ranging convictions, and this includes vague and politically useful charges like breaking allegiance with the ruler, inciting disorder, or sowing discord.
So the king appoints the judges, and the judges, because they lack a codified law, can essentially criminalize any behavior that challenges the dynastic rule. It ensures that the judicial system can never become an independent branch capable of challenging the monarchy.
Exactly. The lack of codification ensures that ultimate control remains with the monarchy, which is the head of the legal system and the final court of appeals. Due process violations, arbitrary arrests, and torture are commonly documented mechanisms of control. Suspects can be held for extended periods without trial, which just demonstrates how the justice system functions primarily as a flexible, severe tool for maintaining the uninterrupted stability of the monarchy.
The ideological DNA is so central to both states, but they're using these competing forms of Islam over Shiism versus Wahhabism, which is the engine for so much of the regional tension.
Yeah.
Let's look at this religious foundation and how it shapes national cohesion and political stability.
Iran's system, as we established, is intrinsically linked to its Twelver Shiite revolutionary identity. The entire governmental structure, the constitution, the legitimacy of the supreme leader, it all flows directly from the sectarian foundation. For Iran, changing this fundamental Shiite revolutionary core would mean the system itself loses its theological justification. It would just collapse.
And Saudi Arabia's religious identity, Wahhabism, is puritanical. It emphasizes the oneness of God, Tawhid, and explicitly denounces practices common in Shiism. Things like reverence for imams or pilgrimages to tombs, often branding them as polytheistic heresy. So how has Saudi Arabia historically utilized this sectarian identity politically?
Well, Saudi Arabia is Sunni and hosts the two holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. It initially amplified its sectarian identity, notably through the Sawa or Islamic Awakening movement in the 1980s. And this was primarily a reactive political strategy. It was a response to the threat posed by Iran's 1979 revolution, which was trying to export its revolutionary ideals to the Sunni world. So Saudi Arabia needed to compete ideologically. They leaned hard into Wahhabi purity to position themselves as the true leaders of the global Muslim Ummah.
But the sources suggest Saudi Arabia has recently been able to pivot away from that strict sectarian alignment, which is something that would be impossible for Iran. Why is the Saudi system architecturally capable of changing its identity module like that?
Because Saudi Arabia's priority is dynastic survival and the state's economic stability, not the ideology itself. When that strict sectarian identity became incompatible with modernization efforts, specifically Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 and his massive development goals, the monarchy simply updated the system. They embraced Saudi nationalism, this Saudi-first unifying force. They prioritized state stability, economic growth, and national identity over strict adherence to Wahhabi ideological purity.
So the Saudi system views Wahhabism as a tool. If the tool starts damaging the machine, say by scaring away foreign investment or alienating the youth, they can just put it back in the toolbox. Iran, on the other hand, is hard-coded.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The Saudi monarchy holds the authority to decide when and how to deploy or retreat from ideology. The shift to a Saudi-first framework required the system to adjust its social code of conduct to allow for greater freedoms and diversification. This is a massive insight into the two systems' foundational differences.
Let's follow that thought and look at how these religious codes dictate social conduct. specifically regarding women and minorities. How does the architecture play out in the daily lives of citizens?
Well, the contrast in legal environments for women is complex. Both countries exhibit significant discrimination, but the nature of the discrimination is different. In Iran, the system wants women to participate in the political and public sphere, but within the bounds of revolutionary Shiite morality. The constitution explicitly guarantees rights like voting and running for office. Iranian women often make up 60% of university students and can hold political positions.
But they hit a legal wall when it comes to family law.
Yes. The discrimination is deeply embedded in family matters: marriage, divorce, inheritance, child custody. For example, a woman needs her male guardian's consent for marriage regardless of her age. And the mandatory Islamic dress code enforced by the Basij morality police is a constant pressure point. While women constantly push the boundaries with loose, colorful hijabs and visible makeup, the code is enforced and they face legal penalties for non-compliance.
And Saudi Arabia's approach to women's status under its dynastic firmware.
In Saudi Arabia, the social control has historically been far more restrictive. It's viewed women fundamentally as legal minors throughout their entire lives. This stems from the informal application of the male guardianship system, which required legal permission from a male guardian, a father, husband, or even a son, for nearly all major life decisions. Things like advanced education, employment outside the home, and travel.
And we've seen incremental changes recently, like the right to vote in municipal elections and the ability to drive.
Right, and those changes, like the right to drive and the slow erosion of the guardianship laws, are directly tied to that Saudi First Update and Vision 2030, which requires women's participation in the workforce. However, gender segregation norms are still prevalent. The public dress code, the enforced cultural norm of the abaya, a loose black cloak, and a headscarf, was historically enforced by the religious police, the mutawin. But the monarchy has since drastically curtailed the powers of the mutawin, which reflects its pragmatic need to project a more modern image to the world and its own population.
Moving on to minority rights. How do these two distinct operating systems handle non-dominant religious groups within their borders?
Iran's system, though it's a Shiite theocracy, formally recognizes Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians in its constitution. They're guaranteed proportionate parliamentary seats, they have religious centers, and they can openly practice their rights, albeit within restrictions. However, they do face systemic discrimination in education and employment, and non-Muslims are barred from serving in the judiciary or high-level security services.
What of the largest minorities there?
Sunnis, who make up maybe 5 to 10% of the population, have reported bans on building mosques, especially in the capital, Tehran. But crucially, Iran's largest religious minority, the Baha'is, are explicitly not protected under the law. Since the system is coded with Torver Shi'ism, the Baha'is are treated as apostates. They're systematically persecuted and barred from attending university or holding any state employment. They're deemed an existential threat to the ideological purity of the state.
And Saudi Arabia's stance on minorities under its Wahhabi-influenced firmware.
Saudi Arabia's basic law requires Sunni Islam as the state religion, and the state does not provide explicit legal protections for minority religions. All public practice of non-Sunni faith is prohibited. This means that minority groups, including Shiites who are concentrated in the oil-rich eastern province and make up 10–15% of the population, are prohibited from publicly practicing their faith. The kingdom's code of conduct requires social homogeneity, and this is enforced through strict application of the state religion. It even forbids non-Muslims from being buried on Saudi soil.
So now we get to where these two opposing systems collide on the global stage. If Iran's core function is revolutionary clerical survival, what does its external module look like? What is its foreign policy engineered to achieve?
Iran's foreign policy is rooted in Islamic supranationalism. The preamble to the constitution explicitly states that the system will strive for the formation of a single world community. It says it will assure the continuation of the struggle for the liberation of all oppressed peoples. The supreme leader dictates that foreign policy must lie within a religious framework. This is the explicit code for anti-status quo disruption.
Right. Ayatollah Khomeini's famous pledge was to export our revolution to the whole world. That's not a conventional foreign policy goal. That sounds like a permanent state of ideological warfare.
It is the revolutionary goal to prioritize loyalty to the global Muslim Ummah over the Westphalian nation-state system. Now, Iran has had limited success exporting its ideology, its soft power strategy of funding clerics trained in Qom. However, Tehran has been wildly successful with its hard power strategy, assisting armed organizations that share its goals. And that allows it to exert influence far beyond its borders without direct military confrontation.
And that's where we see the cultivation of spheres of influence and that massive funding for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas.
Exactly. Iran has cultivated deep spheres of influence, particularly in Shiite communities in Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. This is backed by significant funding. For example, Hezbollah reportedly receives somewhere between $100 to $200 million per year. Hamas, though it's a Sunni organization, has also received up to $300 million annually at times. These investments enhance Iran's ability to project power and expand its strategic depth, particularly against adversaries like Israel and Saudi Arabia.
But this revolutionary code must clash constantly with the need for the Iranian state to just survive in the real world, a world of sanctions, state sovereignty, international treaties. I mean, how does Iran reconcile this massive conflict between pure ideology and practical national interest?
This internal conflict is so central to the system that Tehran had to institutionalize a critical operational code, the concept of maslahat, or expediency. It is the institutionalized mechanism to manage the chronic tension between its revolutionary ideals and the pragmatic necessity of state survival.
So maslahat is essentially the system safety mechanism, the emergency override. How was that formalized?
It's formalized through the Expediency Discernment Council, which was established in 1988. This council intervenes when the elected parliament and the Guardian Council disagree, but its primary function is to determine what is in the expediency of the Islamic system. In essence, it provides the theological cover for the supreme leader to temporarily suspend or halt ideological principles in favor of practical survival. It answers the fundamental question: how can the Vali Faqi justify prioritizing the survival of the state over God's stated law? And Maslahat says the long-term survival of the Islamic Republic is the highest religious duty.
That's the crucial element. It allows the system to be ruthlessly pragmatic when an existential threat is looming. Give us the key historical examples of this pragmatism.
Well, we have two massive examples. First, in 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini himself used the concept of maslahat to justify ending the Iran-Iraq war with a ceasefire. Continuing that devastating war threatened the very existence of the fledgling regime, so survival took precedence over revolutionary zeal. Second, it justified accepting negotiations with the West that led to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, despite the supreme leader's profound ideological opposition to engaging with the great Satan.
Because the crippling economic sanctions posed an immediate existential threat to the state's survival. They were threatening to undermine the clerical leadership. So the survival of the Islamic State gets prioritized over idealist objectives like unyielding anti-Americanism or non-negotiation.
Absolutely. If the state doesn't confront a survival threat, it pursues its ideologically bound foreign policy. But when that threat materializes, when the state's foundation is shaking, it chooses maslahat over revolutionary preferences.
So if Iran's external module is revolutionary export, what is Saudi Arabia's external module? What is its strategic goal?
Saudi Arabia's strategic goal is status quo maintenance. Its foreign policy is engineered to maintain regional stability, protect the global oil market, and consolidate its status as the chief defender of Sunni Islam and the Arab world, specifically countering Iran's revolutionary influence at every single turn.
And their soft power strategy is the propagation of Wahhabism, the Dawah, often powered by that oil wealth.
Yes. Saudi Arabia leverages its vast oil diplomacy and massive funding to export Wahhabism globally through Dawah, the propagation of their faith. They fund mosques, cultural centers, madrasas all over the world. This strategy reinforces its image as the center of the Sunni Muslim world, giving it massive geopolitical influence. The monarchy is dedicated to stability maintenance, which translates into action against disruptive forces regionally.
And we see the dedication to stability maintenance play out directly in conflicts across the region.
Exactly. It's evident in their policy against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which is a direct counter-revolutionary war against a Shiite-aligned proxy on their border, and their extensive military support for Sunni rebels in Syria against the Iranian-backed Assad regime. Their foreign policy dictates that the revolutionary virus must be contained and ultimately purged from the region.
This rivalry plays out in real time across the region, creating these proxy conflicts where the two systems are clashing ideologically, militarily, and economically.
The two nations are engaged in a fierce proxy war for regional dominance, and the tensions are so palpable that even at international peace talks, like the Vienna talks on Syria, the delegations are often seated as far apart as possible to ensure no direct contact. This is a Cold War defined by architectural incompatibility.
And the alignment with global powers also illustrates this deep ideological divergence.
Fundamentally, Iran has a long history of profound anti-Americanism and has had severed diplomatic ties since 1980. It views the U.S. as the great Satan and a primary ideological adversary. Saudi Arabia, conversely, is a key pillar of U.S. policy in the region. It replaced pre-revolution Iran in that role. Riyadh has had diplomatic ties with Washington since 1940, receives massive arms imports, and maintains a long history of security cooperation with the West to ensure the continuity of its dynastic rule.
Finally, let's just consider how Iran uses its hard power ties strategically. It's not just ideological support for these groups, right? It's a critical component of its deterrence strategy.
That's the final insight into the utility of the revolutionary export module. Iran views its ties with non-state actors like Hezbollah and Hamas, not just through an ideological lens, but as a crucial strategic tool to enhance its deterrence and retaliatory capability. These proxy organizations provide a means to widen a conflict or open a new front against an adversary like Israel or the U.S. if Iran's core assets were to be struck. This reliance on local factors also grants Iran the advantage of plausible deniability, allowing the state to claim these organizations are acting independently, thereby easing pressure on Tehran itself. It is a highly effective, low-cost method of system defense.
This analysis just clarifies the profound foundational differences between these two rivals. Iran's system is a revolutionary theocracy where the cleric holds the root password, often sacrificing immediate national interests for long-term ideological survival through that mechanism of maslahat. Its architecture is designed for perpetual revolution.
And Saudi Arabia's system is a dynastic monarchy where the royalty is the firmware. It prioritizes stability and the continuation of Al Saud rule above all else. It will adjust its religious posture, as we saw with the pivot to Saudi nationalism when necessary. There are two distinct, deeply coded realities operating based on different foundational logics. You really cannot understand their foreign policy, their rivalries, or their internal dynamics without grasping these profound architectural differences.
The fundamental differences in their programming suggest different vulnerabilities to future pressures. Iran's system is constantly struggling between its revolutionary code and the pragmatic necessity of state survival, which dictates that its major crises will always be ideological and economic. Saudi Arabia's system, however, is engineered to resist all challenges to its absolute dynastic firmware. This suggests its vulnerabilities are focused on succession and maintaining the internal consensus necessary for the royalty to maintain the system. This foundational reality dictates which kinds of system updates or system crashes are ultimately possible in the Middle East.